In 2016, Magnus was only a draw away from winning the World Championship title once again. After no winner was declared after the classical section, rapid games were played to determine the world champion, just like the recent World Championship between Ding Liren and Jan Nepomniachtchi. In this phase, Magnus already had a win in the rapid section, so at this point in time, he only needed a draw to secure the title. Playing with the white pieces, it just seemed destined to be, but Magnus actually won this game with such a beautiful flourish that it was named one of the greatest queen sacrifices of all time. Magnus decides to begin with e4, staking his claim in the centre. Karyakin responds c5 Sicilian defence. Karyakin needs a win here. If he draws this game, he will lose. Knight f3 by Magnus, classical stuff, and then d6, a Sicilian variation that doesn't even have a name. In fact, it's not named after anyone, so everyone just calls this variation the classical Sicilian. We see d4 by Magnus, trying to exchange that annoying c-pawn that black has, captures, with the knight of course, because if you want to take back with your queen, it's just a slightly bad idea because you're going to get hit with knight c6 with the tempo and the queen. You're going to have to drop it back. So of course Magnus recaptures with the knight. Knight to f6, putting a bit of pressure on this e4 pawn. Magnus defends, but with the f pawn. Obviously still theory, nothing to worry about here. Magnus hasn't just played f3 for no reason, but you know, as Ben Feingold says, never play f3. He's played it here. In the Sicilian note, it's actually quite a popular move, so not unusual to see it here. After Magnus has committed f3, Karyakin immediately strikes back and kicks white's knight out of the centre, e5. But this does have a bit of a weakening factor. This pawn on d6 is now backwards. So of course Magnus has to move his knight. Knight b3. This knight is a little bit out of the game. As you can see, the two easy squares it would once jump to are actually covered by the pawns here. So has to watch out for that. Make sure this knight doesn't get locked out of the game too early. Bishop to e7, Karyakin prepares to castle. c4 by Magnus. Now he adopts a sort of Maroczy bind type setup, where this is what it's called when the e-pawn and the c-pawn both clamp down on d4. This is the setup commonly adopted against what's called the Sicilian dragon variation or the accelerated dragon. And the idea is you just clamp down on this square and you basically don't allow black to get any counterplay in the position. a5 by Karyakin. Here it is, the novelty. Karyakin needs to win, so he can't avoid any horrendously theoretical variations that will just end in equal positions for both sides that Magnus could easily hold. So he has to create some sort of complications, create imbalances to give himself a chance to try and win this game. Bishop to e3 played by Magnus. Again, it's always a very common idea. If you have this little hut of pawns, put your bishop in there. Just fits so nicely, and this bishop controls a lot of squares in a black position. So a4. Now, Karyakin's not messing around. He's going to use that pawn to great effect. Now the knight goes all the way back. Magnus decides to play knight to c3. Bit of an ugly move at first sight. But then when you see the knight can quickly reroute to d3, it's not looking so bad, you know. Knight's got better scope, keeping a bit of an eye on the centre, and that knight isn't actually too bad. So we see castles by Karyakin. Knight to c3, of course, get a piece in the game. And then queen to a5, immediately pinning that knight to the king. So Karyakin's got a decent position here, you know. He's kind of imposing his will on the white position, you know. Probably not the best thing for him to do objectively. But practically speaking, he's caused some problems for white that Magnus is going to have to solve. So queen to d2 played, defending that knight, unpinning himself. Then we see knight a6 by Karyakin, which is a bit of a weird move, but with a clear idea. He clearly wants to go to c5, knight c5. So we see, of course, bishop e2. Magnus can castle if he wants to. Knight c5, now bringing his knight into the white position. This knight now does control a couple key squares and no longer is sitting on a6 looking a bit useless. So we see castles by Magnus, fully avoiding any sort of tactics or tricks with this pin. And then bishop to d7 by Karyakin. Of course, now connecting his rooks, ready to try and cause some problems. Magnus immediately tries to punish black for this play. The only way he can do so, rook b1, preparing to push the b-pawn and get a fork. I think the idea here was he's trying to fork and just hoping Karyakin wouldn't see it. No, of course, that wasn't the idea. Rook f8 was played by Karyakin, and then b4 by Magnus. So not only did he win this game brilliantly, but he also managed to force en passant. Of course, the queen is hit, the knight is hit, but you can take en passant with the pawn, which is forced because otherwise you're going to lose material. A takes b3 en passant. A takes b3 by Magnus, recapturing. And now again, this fork is threatened, so Karyakin has to move his queen or his knight. He chooses the queen, queen d8. Knight d3 by Magnus. Again, here it is, that c knight is now in the game and pressuring this developed piece of black's. This is probably black's most developed piece at this point. I mean, what could you honestly argue was even better than this knight? And I managed to just threaten to trade it off. And of course, one piece traded off is one piece closer to a draw, because of course if you have only kings left, that's just going to be a draw. So knight e6. Karyakin has to relinquish his most developed piece. He has to relinquish its control of the centre. And now Magnus's pieces kind of all bunched up, but much better placed than all Black's pieces. So we see knight b4, Magnus getting his knight further into the game, eyeing up that juicy d5 square. And of course, if you want to capture that knight at any point in time, you can just recapture the knight on c3 and just get an absolutely dominant knight outpost, because of course this knight does control that square. So Karakin thinks he cannot allow this. Bishop to c6, controlling d5 one more time, and then we see rook fd1, getting that rook on the open file and preparing for some sort of opening of the centre, because maybe if you move your queen, you're going to have this beautiful X-ray of the rook onto the queen, and opens up the door for a myriad of tactical opportunities for Magnus. So we see h5 by Karyakin. Again, trying to get some sort of complications, trying to maybe force Magnus to play a move like h5 himself, which gives himself a little bit of a target in the white camp. Magnus doesn't react, plays bishop f1, very interesting move. Basically just frees up the movement of his pieces a little bit more. This bishop on e2 was controlling an important square. Now his queen can slide over, maybe try and get to the king side, or maybe in future looking for some other maneuver, maybe getting his knight to this square, but we're going to have to see. h4 by Karyakin, continuing to attack the white king, but as you can see, you don't really want to attack when you have a lot of your pieces ready to jump into the attack with you. This pawn is sort of going in solo. Maybe it can cause some sort of damage to the white king side, but it's unlikely Black is actually going to be able to capitalise on anything created. Queen to f2 by Magnus. Now this immediately threatens bishop to b6, a very annoying infiltration of the bishop which hits the queen. Getting a tempo on that, it's going to have to move out the way, and this bishop is just going to completely discombobulate and cut off the circulation of Black's position. So Karyakin cannot allow this. Knight d7, controlling that square, and then we see g3 by Magnus. Thinks, let's get this annoying pawn out of the way, and also of course Karyakin can't just push because Magnus will just capture that. So rook a3 by Karyakin finally decides to infiltrate on the queen side. Now his play stops on the king side, so very smartly he decides to start. So intelligently he decides, king side play is done, I'm just going to start trying to attack on the queen side. Bishop to h3 by Magnus, now using the luft created by g2, and now this bishop just sees everything. Two knights and a rook, all in this absolute kebab of a skewer by the bishop. Rook ac8, Karyakin doubling up on the a file, but I mean, what's he really doing here? He's doubling up to go what? Rook a1 and trade everything and immediately offer a draw. Like, it's hard to see what the idea of this is. I mean, this b3 pawn is a little bit weak, but you're just never getting to attack it. Because if you ever want to jump a knight in here, Magnus is just going to take, and eventually he's going to have this lovely outpost on d5, and Black's position is just going to crumble. So Karyakin's got to find something better than this. Knight c2 by Magnus, and Karyakin is forced to retreat. Rook a6 is all he has. With all these squares being controlled by the knights, he can't just go to a2 and have a pin, which would be quite nice, because obviously knight just controls that a2 square. What now? Knight b4 by Magnus. Putting knight back in, of course, you can go back to a3, but then you're just going to have a repetition, and Magnus is going to win the world championship. So Karyakin, again, has to find something, has to prove that his position is good enough for a win. Rook a5. Knight c2. Again, going back. Magnus looking for some sort of repetition, because of course, he needs a draw. He's happy with a draw. b6, no draw. Karyakin sinks, trying to make some sort of complications, has to push b6 to avoid some sort of drawish sequence, and then rook d2 by Magnus, preparing to double on the d file, also protecting this knight in case Karyakin decides to infiltrate later on in time. Queen to c7, gets the queen off the back rank. Now the queen is away from this x-ray of the rook, because obviously the rooks, if these pawns and knights were to clear out, that queen would be under threat. So queen c7 just avoids that for future. Rook b to d1, Magnus again doubles up on the d file. He's ready to crash through. Hopefully he can try and get a breakthrough in this black position and sort of bind setup Black has. You know, it's not the most active thing. You know, Black's not exactly going to be crushing white here, but it's not easy to find it in a way to break through here. So we see bishop to fa, freeing up the squares for white. Maybe Black's rook's going to go to e8 or something like this. This again sort of frees up. Maybe Black's going to move the knight and get the queen here or something, but I guess we're going to see the idea of this move at a later date. G takes h4, Magnus finally decides to capture that pawn, opening up his king, but again, we can't think of things as just principles. Is there any way Black can actually exploit the weakening of white's king here? Not really. I mean, this knight can try and get in, but the bishop will just exchange it. This knight's going to struggle to get to that side of the board, so Magnus has evaluated that this is completely fine for him to do so. And now he's just got an extra pawn on Black's king side. Should he try to attack? Knight f4. Again, Sergei tries to get in, but of course Magnus is just going to exchange that. Bishop takes f4, e takes f4, and then bishop takes d7. Queen takes d7. 2 more pieces are off the board. Magnus is 2 more pieces closer to a draw and 2 more pieces closer to winning his World Championship title back. Knight b4. Rook a3. Going in with the rook. Again, Sergei trying to start this pressure on that b-pawn. Magnus this time. Knight takes c6. Queen takes c6. More pieces are off the board. And knight b5. This is a great move by Magnus. You're thinking, okay, he's hit the rook, but surely you can just grab that pawn. Well, if you missed the idea, so did Sergei Karyakin. Rook takes b3, and this just walks into a fork. Knight d4, hits the queen, hits the rook. Of course, you have to save one. You're going to save the queen. Queen takes c4. Sergei grabs another pawn for his troubles. Of course, Magnus captures the rook. Queen takes knight, and Magnus is actually up 1 point of material because Sergei had 1 pawn extra for the exchange. Queen e2 played by Magnus, trying to get his queen more active because this pawn does control some squares that the queen would maybe want to go to. Bishop to e7. Of course, this bishop can't go too many squares. This does actually target the h4 pawn, so there's actually an idea here. King to d2 by Magnus, of course, always extremely accurate in the endgame. Here we see a little bit of shuffling. Players trying to prove some sort of advantage, trying to force a draw. Here again, repetition. Of course, Sergei Karyakin has to go back, has to find something. Draw is simply not good enough. Rook d5. Magnus infiltrating his rook into position. Maybe he's going to go g5 at a later date, of course. Bishop controls that square for now, but this rook could be quite scary. Also halts the progression of white's d-pawn, which, if he tried to push that, of course, white would not be able to take because the queen would hang in that variation. So we see rook to c7, queen d2, setting up an Alekhine's gun on the d-file. All 3 pieces stacked up. All of his artillery pointed at that 1 pawn, which is somehow just about defended enough. Queen to f6. Karyakin has to try and start something on the king side. Maybe he can get some sort of attack going here. Rook f5, hits the queen. Queen's got to move. Queen h4 into the white position. Rook c1, offering a trade of rooks. Rook a7, declines. Queen takes f4. Magnus offers another trade of queens, but wait. He's opened up his king to a nasty check. Rook a2 check. And here, you need to play with remarkable precision. If you decide to go to f1, Queen f2 is mate. If you want to go to g1, Queen f2, followed by Queen g2 check after you slide over to h1, is going to be mate as well. Magnus, only 1 move, has to play King h1 here. And then Queen to f2 played by Karyakin. Karyakin is threatening mate in 1, but Magnus saw this. Magnus knew this was coming because he has 1 bit of play left in the position. His most active piece, check on the back rank, king is forced up, and in this position, Magnus played one of the most brilliant queen sacrifices I've ever seen in my life. Magnus calculated this is in fact mate in 2. After queen to h6 check, Sergei Karyakin resigned the game. You can't take this queen. If you decide to take with the pawn, g takes h6, then rook f7 is checkmate because this square is controlled by the pawn and your pawn blocks in your own king, and this rook controls the back rank. If you want to take with the king, then simply rook h8 is checkmate because both rooks defend his pawn. The pawn controls that square and the rook is checking from the back. The king is blocked in by its own pawn. Very hard to spot that queen h6 move. Just brilliancy from Magnus. So if you enjoyed that, just give me another video popping up now that YouTube also thinks you're going to enjoy, so probably worth to give that one a watch. Maybe leave a comment, a like, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.